October 1845. Inventor Elias Howe was struggling with a problem. He was trying to build a sewing machine, but one crucial mechanical issue kept defeating him: the needle. Then, according to the famous story, he had a dream. In it, he was surrounded by hostile figures holding spears, and near the tips of those spears were holes. When he woke up, he had the answer. The hole in the needle didn't belong at the back, it belonged near the point. That insight helped change everything. So here's the question. Where did his brain get the information? Did he solve the problem consciously? Or did the answer come from somewhere below the level of awareness? From a part of the mind that seemed to know what he did not? Because if that can happen once, if a solution can arrive suddenly, fully formed, then how many of our thoughts are really created by the conscious self we identify with? And how many simply arrive? Every person knows this feeling. A thought appears, not one you deliberately sat down to think, not one you reasoned toward step by step, just there. A phrase, a memory, a warning, a lyric, a solution. And sometimes it feels so oddly placed that, for a second, you wonder, did that come from me? We usually dismiss that question immediately, because daily life depends on the assumption that the mind is a closed room, that thoughts arise inside it, belong to it, and end there. But what if that picture is incomplete? What if the brain is not just generating thoughts, but also handing them to consciousness after deeper processes have already begun? Before that sounds too mystical, let's stay grounded. The brain is an electrochemical system. Billions of neurons are firing, signaling, and exchanging information constantly, even when you think you're doing nothing at all. And scientists have already learned how to detect some of that hidden activity from the outside. EEG can measure brainwaves. Brain-computer interfaces can translate neural signals into actions. Researchers can identify activity linked to movement, speech, perception, and even intention. In 2008, scientists working with Professor John Dylan Haynes used fMRI scanners to study what happens in the brain just before a decision becomes conscious. Participants were told they could freely choose whether to press a button with their left hand or right hand whenever they wanted. They also had to remember the moment they became aware of making that choice. The researchers found they could predict the decision 10 seconds before the person reported consciously deciding. Think about that. Your brain may already be moving toward a choice 10 seconds before the conscious feeling of choosing arrives. If that's true, then consciousness may not always be the origin of a thought or decision. Sometimes it may be the moment you become aware of something already in motion. And that raises another question. If brain activity can be detected, can it also be influenced? There have already been experiments showing that electrical stimulation of the brain can affect mood, perception, motion, and judgment. Stimulate one circuit, and severe depression can ease. Stimulate the visual cortex, and a person can see flashes of light that aren't really there. Stimulate motor regions, and a person may feel the urge to move. Stimulate parts of the frontal brain, and even the way a person makes certain judgments can begin to shift. That doesn't mean the self is fake, but it does mean the self may be more fragile and more constructed than it feels. There's another famous story like Howe's. Chemist Auguste Kekulé had been trying to understand the structure of benzene. Then, in a dreamlike state, he saw a snake seize its own tail, a ring. That image helped lead him to the idea of the benzene ring. Again, the pattern is the same. The conscious mind struggles. The problem is set aside. Then the answer appears in symbolic form. Not through deliberate step-by-step reasoning, but through image, intuition, or dream. So what is happening in those moments? One explanation is simple. Your brain is always processing in the background. Comparing patterns, testing possibilities, working below awareness. In that view, Howe and Kekulé did not receive answers from outside themselves. Their brains solved the problem offline. The dream was simply the moment the answer surfaced. That is a reasonable explanation. But it does not make the experience less strange. Because if your own brain can hand you information that feels foreign, then there is already something unsettling inside ordinary consciousness, a system beneath the self, something in you that knows before you know, something that can produce an answer without showing you the steps. And then there are the smaller moments, the urge to take a different road, a sudden certainty that something is wrong, thinking of someone moments before they call, a dream that produces not just emotion, but an answer. Each of these can be explained on its own: coincidence, subconscious processing, selective memory, pattern recognition. Maybe that is all they are. But the feeling they leave behind is hard to ignore. The feeling that the mind is doing more than the conscious self can see. That thoughts do not always feel manufactured. Sometimes they feel caught, received, delivered from somewhere deeper and hidden. That does not mean every strange thought is profound. Not every dream is a revelation. Not every intuition is true. The mind also produces noise, fear, fantasy, distortion, false patterns. But mixed in with that noise, sometimes something useful arrives: a solution, a warning, an image, a complete idea. And it arrives with that eerie feeling that it was not constructed in words, but perhaps delivered by a vast, unfathomable ocean of universal thought. Maybe what we call thinking is not always the act of creating a thought. Maybe sometimes it is the act of becoming aware of one. So when Elias Howe dreamed the answer to the sewing machine problem, maybe the real question is not whether some outside force delivered it. Maybe the real question is this: how much of your intelligence operates outside the person you think you are? How much of your life is guided by processes you never witness? How many of your thoughts arrive already formed, with consciousness acting less like an author and more like an observer? You only ever meet a thought once it crosses into awareness. By then, the deeper process may already be over. And once you really feel that, even for a moment, the ordinary experience of thinking becomes strange. Because the next time a thought appears out of nowhere, the next time a dream hands you something useful, the next time you know something before you know how you know it, you may find yourself asking, did I create that thought? Or did I receive it?